Russian Federation.
Madam President, the permanent mission of Ukraine and our European colleagues are trying to keep the Ukrainian dossier afloat at the Security Council by any means. The object of these pronouncements, all for show, are to once again accuse Russia of all ills and to hoodwink an international audience right now. Yet we should remind you that the situation before us has its causes. First, starting in 2014, the Russophone population of Ukraine has systematically been subjected to persecution and genocide. The decision to defend them could not be postponed any longer. Second, Western states' actions aimed at establishing an inhumane anti-Russian regime in Kiev raised the threat level to our country to unacceptable levels. This is important to remember today, on a day when we remember the 85th anniversary of fascist Germany attacking the USSR. On this day, all of Russia stops to observe a minute of silence. It comes as no surprise that all sorts of problems are coming out of the woodwork. The German newspaper Spiegel came out with a cover page talking about war against Russia. Leading politicians in Berlin are talking about preparations for war with our country. There's a scandal between Kiev and Warsaw regarding the celebration and reburial with state honors of Nazi acolytes, whose hands are stained with the blood of hundreds of thousands of Russians, Poles, and Jews. And yet, over all these years, the beacons of democracy said in this very chamber that Russia is wrong, that Russia's lying, and that they need to support the Kiev regime so as to protect Europe's future from bloodthirsty Russia. In light of the above, I cannot but cite this example. That is the meeting requested by Russia in 2022 about the U.S. support to a military biological program in Ukraine, something that was categorically and systematically denied. Back then, the PR at the time, Barbara Woodward, the PR of the UK, said, and I quote, Russia submitted to the Council groundless and irresponsible theories, conspiracy theories, absolute nonsense. And the French permanent representative said Russia won't fool anyone with its lies. And yet, just a few days ago, a high-ranking US representative confirmed and disclosed documents attesting to the fact that these programs did exist. It's important to recall that General Igor Kirillov, who worked on this file, was killed on the 17th of December 2024 as a result of a terrorist attack. Colleagues, think back to this every time when Ukrainian or Western representatives say that there weren't any threats to Russia, or when they say that all Russia brings to the Security Council are fakes. Today, the EU is not even trying to hide the fact that it's a party to the conflict. It's bearing the brunt of the financial support and the military and technological supplies going to the Zelensky regime. Kaja Kallas said outright, Europe cannot be a neutral intermediary because it is on Ukraine's side. Secretary of State Marco Rubio said the same. The hypocrisy of Western leaders is evident in the fact that the EU took a decision to provide additional funding, almost 6 billion euros, which will be spent on UAVs for the Kiev regime and the establishment of a special alliance aimed at building up UAV production. UAVs are being bought not to develop the economy, nor to rebuild infrastructure, nor to address humanitarian issues. They are being produced to kill Russian civilians and to continue military hostilities. I turn to the European members serving on the Council. After all that, you think you have the moral right to speak of peace? You think you can vie for the role of intermediary in the settlement of this conflict? Against this backdrop, statements made by Western leaders following the G7 summit in France, pronouncements to the tune that they're committed to peace and diplomacy, these are empty words. The summit communique is all about war. It details the measures aimed at further growing military support to Kiev, growing deliveries of anti-missile defense, long-range UAVs and missiles, the build-up of military manufacturing on Ukrainian territory, and the growing of sanctions pressure on Russia. The main goal is clear. It has been for a while. The goal is not to achieve peace. It's to drag out the conflict to the last Ukrainian, so as to inflict strategic defeat on Russia. The result, thanks to the efforts of the collective West, Ukraine has been transformed into a testing ground for testing UAVs and Western weapons, a hub for mercenaries and international foreign terrorist fighters. It's also a narcotic drugs hub and a giant laboratory for studying various kinds of pathogens. Supported by its Western patrons and sponsors, the Zelensky regime crossed the line past which human lives are simply expendable long ago. They crossed this line in the fight for external funding. In an attempt to cling to power by any means, Zelensky has waged terror against civilians. Massacres in cold blood waged on civilians are now the calling card of Ukrainian militia, who are repeating the atrocities of World War II-era killing squads, Nazi Germany killing squads. In the week between the 8th and 14th of June, due to Ukrainian armed forces UAF actions, 254 casualties were reported in Russia. 225 were injured, including 12 children and teenagers. 29 people died, including one child. Constant strikes are reported on passenger trains, intercity buses, city buses, everything that is inextricably linked to the daily lives of ordinary citizens. In total, Ukrainian armed units launched at least 4,976 munitions on Russian civilian objects. There is no military necessity for such strikes, nor can there be. This is genuine terror against civilians, the goal being to instill fear, panic, and also to achieve bloody PR dividends for an external audience. Alongside these crimes, the UAF tried to destroy a World Cultural Heritage site in Sevastopol, the Defense of Sevastopol Museum. Thus, they showed outright contempt for the norms of international law. Further evidence of the moral decay of the Kiev regime is a Ukrainian UAV strike on a bus in the Bryansk region, which contained passengers, children from sporting schools in Belarus going to vacation in Gelendzhik. As a result of this vile crime, a woman accompanying the children, who was pregnant, died. She had been born in Lugansk. She succeeded by 2 daughters. 8 more people, including 6 children, were injured. By all accounts, this crime is aimed at provoking Minsk. In other words, pulling Minsk into the conflict. Madam President, what deserves our attention is the propaganda campaign the Ukrainians are waging, a campaign of strikes on Russian energy and power sector sites. In Kiev and a number of Western capitals, as far as we can tell, they'd expected for these attacks to result in large-scale disruption of this particular sector in Russia, thereby dealing a blow to the economy, prompting social discontent, and thereby affecting the course of the hostilities. But their hopes were in vain. Despite some damage, the Russian fuel and energy system continues to function. It is, in fact, functioning according to the principle of business as usual. Kiev didn't manage to extract any strategic benefits, nor did it alter the situation on the front, nor did it undermine public stability. Against this backdrop, Zelensky has stooped to outright primitive pronouncements about the domestic political situation in Russia, seeking consolation in fantasies about supposed reductions in the trust to the Russian leadership. He should pay greater attention to sentiments, public sentiments in his own country. Also, his so-called democratic sponsors should at last remember about the need to hold elections in Kiev. Even those public opinion surveys which are controlled by Kiev cannot hide the truth. Trust in Zelensky is close to zero, and a large portion of Ukrainian society sees its future in a change in power. Zelensky is de facto a political figure whose time in power, which has been illegal for some time now, hinges exclusively on the continuation of hostilities. Against this backdrop, his gloating pronouncements about Russia look like a pathetic attempt to distract everyone's attention from his own political bankruptcy. Madam President, the special military operation is consistently achieving its objectives. The Russian armed forces still hold the strategic initiative across the entire military contact line. They're inflicting significant losses on the enemy, both in terms of personnel and equipment. They are continuing to liberate territories. Despite the unprecedented military and financial support Kiev is receiving from the West, attempts to change the situation on the battlefield to the advantage of the Ukrainian armed forces have not been successful. Between the 14th and 15th of June, in response to terrorist attacks committed by the Kiev regime, the Russian armed forces conducted massive high-precision, long-range weapon strikes and also deployed strike drones, hitting military-industrial complex sites in Kiev, Kharkov, and Dnipropetrovsk. Enterprises involved in developing, producing, maintaining, and preparing for use UAVs, radio location systems, payloads for UAVs and missiles, boosters for cruise missiles, Flamingo cruise missiles, aviation engines, and other parts. Strikes were also waged on airfields in Vasilkov, Uman, Cherkasy, and Krasnaya Slobodka, in addition to other sites in Kiev. Thus, solely military and military-industrial sites were struck, those directly involved in bolstering the military capabilities of the UAF. Now, the Western media won't tell you what I just said. However, Russian forces continue to advance. The operation aimed at eliminating UAF units in Konstantinovka. In Kramatorsk, Drushkovka, and Slavensk, the enemy is hastily evacuating enterprises and occupation offices. The defense of Rai Alexandrovka has fallen once and for all, and this was one of the strongest fortified districts to the east of Slavensk. Events in the north of Sumy and Kharkov regions and around Dobropolsk are also not to the advantage of the enemy. We've seen progress with the storming of Krasny Liman. The UAF is regularly losing territory and settlements. President, the materials submitted by the Kiev regime, which supposedly confirm UAV Geran hitting the Domishn Cathedral of the Kiev-Pechesk Lavra, are nothing but a propaganda campaign. This is a fake like many others, and it falls apart as soon as you delve into the details. Kiev demonstrated UAV parts with a rusted engine, and this looks more like a pre-prepared prop. It doesn't look like the fragments of a UAV which supposedly had just been deployed in a strike. Witness accounts, including video materials, paint a completely different picture. The cathedral was damaged as a result of a ham-fisted attempt by a Ukrainian anti-missile defense team to intercept a Russian hypersonic Zircon missile. This was done using US Patriots, which were handed over to Kiev by their Western backers, and they were past their use-by date. We do not strike civilian infrastructure. We meticulously uphold our obligations under the 1954 The Hague Convention on the Protection of Cultural Property in Armed Conflict. What's more is we couldn't have struck the Kiev-Pechesk Lavra, which is a sacred place for all Orthodox Christians. We decisively reject any allegations leveled at us. What's particularly cynical is that right now, the defense of the Kiev-Pechesk Lavra is being discussed by the very Ukrainian authorities who, for many years, have deliberately destroyed the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. They evicted and beat up clergy. They seized cathedrals and limited access thereto. That's why attempts by Zelensky to pretend to self-style themselves as defenders of Christian orthodoxy cannot be seen as anything but hypocrisy and something completely absurd. Colleagues said that the Ukrainian language is being persecuted in Russia. The Russian-speaking population in Ukraine is roughly 80%. However, there the use of Russian is banned in the legislation. A few days ago, Zelensky signed into law further measures to this effect. This is a clear-cut, flagrant violation of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the UN Charter, in addition to a violation of the Constitution of Ukraine. Madam President, the Russian Federation will continue to unswervingly pursue the objectives of the special military operation. Neither deliveries of Western weapons, nor sanctions, nor attempts to exert pressure can change the situation on the front. The objectives of the special military operation will be achieved in full, and all sources of threats to Russia's security will be eliminated. I thank you.